We are live.
Okay. Good evening, everybody. Many of us are aware of the self-declared strict but cowardly King Julian from the movie series Madagascar. Today, we have with us Dr. Clarke, who has spent over 16 years in the island of Madagascar with King Julian and his family of lemurs. To tell you a bit about Dr. Clarke, she is a lecturer in the Department of Sociology and Anthropology at North Carolina State University. Currently, she teaches a primate conservation seminar and introduction to biological anthropology. She is an invited member of the IUCN SSC Primate Specialist Group section for Human-Primate Interactions and has been conducting research and conservation initiatives in Madagascar for the past 16 years. Tara also serves as the Chief Primate Conservationist at Darwin Animal Doctors, a US-based NGO. Her work aims to understand the motivations during the illegal pet trade of lemurs within Madagascar, which is their homeland. This work employs a multidisciplinary approach, including conservation genetics, formal and informal surveys with local communities, collaborators with local and international NGOs, as well as conservation outreach and education initiatives. It would be my honor to welcome Dr. Clarke to this platform.
Thank you so much, Smitha. Thank you guys so much. Good evening. I hope you're all safe and well, wherever you find yourself tonight. Thank you so much to the Association of Indian Primatologists for inviting me to give this talk. I'm really excited to be able to talk to you guys today about my love for lemurs, why they're special, why Madagascar is special, and why it's under threat, and how my research is addressing conservation for lemurs. So let's get started. Okay, so to begin, I am going to break this talk up into three different parts. So sort of three main blocks. And so I want to kind of go through just a brief outline to introduce you to the things that I'm going to be talking about today. So to begin, I'm going to talk about why Madagascar is such an exceptional place. So things like the island history, geological history, and of course, its immense biodiversity. And then second, I'm going to talk about why Madagascar is vanishing. What are the conservation threats? Why are we losing forests? Why are these endemic animals that we find on the island, why are they so critically endangered? And then I'm going to talk about novel approaches to conservation. And I'm going to highlight three different pieces of work that my colleagues and I have been working on, some that are published and some that are coming out. And so we're going to talk a little bit about social media, citizen science, and wildlife forensic genetics. And then in the end, we're just sort of going to wrap everything up with a conclusion and the Q&A. Okay, so let's get started. So to begin, Madagascar has an exceptional geological history that many people find kind of fascinating, and I hope you will too. This geological history has contributed to the unparalleled levels of endemism that we find across the island. So let's go back 170 million years ago, where Madagascar, as you can see here on the illustration in red, Madagascar was part of the supercontinent Gondwana. And it was located between what would eventually become South America, Africa, India, and Antarctica, as well as Australia. And then, of course, over time, plate tectonics, shifting of the Earth's crust, Madagascar and India were attached, and then they broke off of the supercontinent. Then India broke off from Madagascar, moving north, crashing into Asia, creating the Himalaya mountains. And then Madagascar was left just isolated in the Indian Ocean for about 88 million years. And it's this extended period of isolation that is contributed to these high rates of endemism of plants and animals that we find across the island today. So one of the really exceptional things I think about Madagascar that a lot of people don't know is that there's been very recent extinctions of giant megafauna. So up until only about 1,000 years ago, Madagascar was home to a diversity of incredible creatures, which have since gone extinct. These creatures include things like the elephant bird pictured here, pygmy hippopotamus, giant fossa, which is a cat-like carnivore, pygmy hippos, giant tortoises, and the thing that I think is most cool is the giant lemurs that used to once run around Madagascar. The elephant bird pictured here, this is one of the largest or the largest flightless birds ever in history. It stands about 3 meters tall, weighing about 450 kilograms. And the eggs that this bird would produce are the largest eggs laid by any animal. So really kind of incredible to think that these things were just running around 1,000 years ago. So a little bit about these giant lemurs. They're also referred to as subfossil lemurs, and you can see a picture here from the Division of Fossil Primates at Duke University. This is a subfossil lemur skull, Megalatopus, which is one of the larger species. And these guys were significantly larger than today's extant lemurs or living lemurs. The largest of the subfossil lemurs were the Archaeoindres. They're also known as sloth lemurs due to their motion and locomotion in the trees and sort of the types of diets that they had. They were about the size of a male gorilla. So we're talking about 160 kilograms of lemur running around. But unfortunately, these large-bodied megafauna have all gone extinct. So we've lost 17 species of giant lemur. And today we're left with their relatives, the smaller extant lemurs that you're probably more familiar with. So how did these guys go extinct? Well, it's been debated, and there's sort of been numerous hypotheses that have been put forth to sort of suggest how the megafauna went extinct. But there's been some really recent interesting research that has suggested that, yes, hunting by early humans contributed to the decline of these species, but it was really a shift from where they were hunting and foraging to doing more of herding and farming. So there was sort of a shift in sort of what early humans were doing in Madagascar. And there was also a sort of a population expansion across the island. So these things combined were sort of what finally led to the decline and ultimate extinction of these species. So basically, hunting for survival was less important. And eventually people became reliant on agriculture and livestock. However, there was still hunting going on, and we have lots of evidence of this in the subfossils. We see lots of cut marks that shows butchering and things like that. So we know that they were still being hunted, but just not as much. And sadly, we don't have any giant lemurs left today. So one of the other really fascinating things I think about Madagascar is its late colonization. So as I just mentioned, the giant megafauna, these giant lemurs and other creatures that were running around Madagascar just 1,000 years ago, they were contemporary with modern early humans. So I can't actually imagine what it must have been like, hunting an elephant bird or, running around the forest and seeing giant lemurs hanging out in the trees or, running around on the ground. That's kind of incredible. But the late colonization, of Madagascar is also something where the dates have been debatable. But recent evidence by my colleagues have suggested that humans were actually present on Madagascar approximately 10,000 years ago. So this is actually 6,000 years earlier than had been previously thought for a long time. So this is quite exciting. And there's also been recent genetic work that has been done, and it has shown that we have independent colonizations from both East Africa as well as Southeast Asia to the island. So we have East Africans coming across the Mozambique Channel to the western coasts of Madagascar. And then of course we have individuals coming through Southeast Asia down to the sort of northern coasts of Madagascar. So the thing that people probably are most familiar with about Madagascar, of course, is its biodiversity. It's sort of the most incredible magical place, at least I think so. And 90% of Madagascar's vascular plants are found nowhere else on the planet. So the plant endemism is really off the charts. The things that you'll see in Madagascar, both flora and fauna, most of that is you're not going to find anywhere else in the world. And so to say that the diversity is immense would really be an understatement. So what I'd like to do now is kind of go through and highlight some of the really incredible biodiversity that we find on the island. And so to start, I thought we could look at some of the Malagasy carnivores. So the Malagasy carnivores are very unique. They belong to a family, the Viveridae family, and it's made up of these small to medium-sized mammals, as you can see here. We've got some little civets, and we've got the fossa down in the bottom right, which is the largest Malagasy carnivore. And these guys are found across a variety of habitats. So we find them in rainforest habitats, we find them in grasslands, we find them in spiny desert. So, oh, sorry guys, that's my cat. And 7 out of 8 of these carnivores are endemic. So they're not found anywhere else on the planet. And the fossa, as I mentioned before, down in the bottom, this is the largest. It weighs about 26 pounds as an adult. And these are one of the lemur's greatest predators. So they really love to eat lemurs. Okay. And next, let's talk about some amphibians. So Madagascar, the only amphibians you're going to find on Madagascar are frogs. But the diversity of frogs, again, is incredible. With more than 300 species of frogs, 99% of those species are endemics. And so you can see here sort of just the beautiful array of colors and sizes that you can find of these beautiful amphibians. So mantella frogs are super cool. They use their bright colors to advertise their toxic skin. And they will secrete, these toxic secretions to predators. And this is sort of, their defense in terms of how they protect themselves. Then we also have these really cool tomato frogs, which are the little red ones down on the bottom. They release this sort of sticky, gluey substance, and it will actually protect them against predators. So they sort of have this other kind of interesting defense. And it can cause allergic reactions in humans. So lots of sort of weird, cool things going on with all these different fauna of Madagascar. So in terms of reptiles, Madagascar hosts more than 400 species of reptiles. 96% of the island's reptiles are endemic. And Madagascar is home to about half of the world's 150 chameleon species, which is sort of incredible. And the other really amazing thing is that we have new species that are still being discovered. In fact, 2018, there were 3 new species of chameleon discovered. And Madagascar is also home to the smallest known species of chameleon, which is this little guy up here, this little Bruchisia species up on the top. So teeny tiny, he's on the head of a matchstick. So you can imagine how cute that must be if you can actually find one in the forest. So now to my favorite part is the lemur diversity. So Madagascar's endemic primates are the lemurs. They're an ancient radiation, evolved in isolation for over 40 million years. And of course, you can see here from the slide, there's just an incredible diversity of lemur species. And there's more still being discovered, and there are more yet to be described. Since the year 2000, we have discovered and described 51 new lemur species. So it's really incredible. But sadly, lemurs are the most endangered group of primates. So 95% are listed as endangered or critically endangered by the IUCN. And we're going to talk about their threats shortly. But first, let's talk a little bit about lemurs some more. So one of the questions that I get a lot is, well, if Madagascar was isolated for so long, 88 million years, how did lemurs get there? Well, another interesting story. They rafted there. So there were large pieces of land that were breaking off of the African continent. And due to sort of the perfect storm of the paleo sort of climate and currents, they were sort of washing those large pieces of floating vegetation carrying ancestral lemurs to the western coast of Madagascar. So they kind of crossed right over the Mozambique Channel, which is about maybe 250 kilometers or so from the eastern coast of Africa to the western coast of Madagascar. So not very far. And this is something that we've seen with other species as well, where you can they can survive on these large pieces of floating vegetation for extended period of time. And then luckily, this floating piece of vegetation crashed into Madagascar. And at 60 million years ago, we had the ancestral lemurs spreading out across the island. They had an adaptive radiation. So there were no competitors at this time. There's no monkeys, there's no humans. So these ancestral lemurs were really able to take advantage of these open ecological niches. And so this is sort of what has contributed to the great diversity that we see today. Oops, sorry, there we go. Okay, so what is it about lemurs that fascinates so many of us, that draw people in? Well, it's true. They're undeniably adorable. They're charismatic. They have their individual personalities. But the lemur diversity is so incredible. So there's really something for everyone. So here I have pictured the Indri, which is the largest living lemur, and adults can get up to 9.5 kilograms. You'll find them in the southeast rainforests of Madagascar. They live in monogamous groups, monogamous pairs. They have a beautiful haunting call. They sing duets to sort of tell other Indri pairs where their territory is and to not come any closer, sort of as a territorial defense. And so they're sort of definitely one of the most loved and beautiful lemur species. And then we have the teeny tiniest of the lemurs, which are the mouse lemurs. And so this here is Madame Berthay's mouse lemur. It's the smallest of all the mouse lemurs, weighing in at only 30 grams. So super tiny, could fit in the palm of your hand. And they're also the smallest primate in the world. So really, the diversity is really incredible. And if we think about sort of those extinct giant lemurs that used to be running around Madagascar, the diversity was even greater just 1,000 years ago. But lemurs are more than just adorable. And they have a lot of interesting traits and behaviors that really set them apart from other types of primates. So I want to kind of go now through some really cool facts about lemurs. Some of them you might be familiar with. So most lemur species live in female-dominated societies, with ring-tailed lemurs actually being the most female-dominant of all of the species. So Smitha at the beginning mentioned King Julian with the Madagascar films. And so unfortunately, it was a King Julian, but really it should have been a Queen Julian, because female ring-tailed lemurs are the ones that are ruling the roost. They lead their troops. They lead defense between intergroup encounters. They're the first ones who get to choose, where they want to sit, where they want to sleep. They get, access to the best resources, and, they are socially dominant to males. So males are very, very subordinate to females, and they get beat up a lot. Lemurs are monomorphic. So you'll notice probably when if you've viewed primates in the wild, or if you've looked at primates in zoos, most primates, males and females, are sexually dimorphic. So males are larger than females. But lemurs, the males and females are actually the same size, which is quite unusual, especially when we think about females being dominant. And there are some species where females can be slightly larger than the males. So this is very unusual for primates. And one of the other really cool things about lemurs that we see with lots of different species is they're sexually dichromatic. So you can see here on the bottom, these beautiful blue-eyed black lemurs. And so the female is that sort of beautiful orange one with the blue eyes, and then the male is black. And so there's a lot of different lemur species where males and females will have different colors or markings, and it's a really great way for you to actually distinguish between them. And that comes in handy if you're studying them and they're high up in the trees. So some other sort of cool things about lemurs. There are a lot of nocturnal species. So there's only one nocturnal monkey species in the world, and that is the owl monkey, which is found in parts of South America. There's no nocturnal old world monkeys, and of course, all of the apes are diurnal, so they are day active. But the lemurs have lots of different species of nocturnals, and those are the mouse lemurs and dwarf lemurs. And so pictured here, we've got this adorable fat-tailed dwarf lemur, and they hibernate, which is also quite unusual for mammals, but very unusual for primates. So they are the only primate in the world that is known to hibernate for extended periods of time. So, why do they do this? Well, they're found in dry deciduous forests in both Western and Southern Madagascar. So during the seasons where there's lots of fruit and flower abundance, these guys are just gorging on all the food that they can find. And they're storing all of that fat, and it goes right into their tails. And those tails will actually end up being about 40% of their body weight when they're done eating by the end of that season. And then they're going into this hibernation during the lean season. So the seasons when there's really going to be scarce resources. And so this is a way for them to adapt and to survive. And so they store all that fat in their tails, and then they live off of that fat during these hibernation states. And one of the other really cool things about these guys is that they will make underground hibernacles. So they don't only use tree holes when they're hibernating, but they also will dig and sort of be right below the surface of the earth, which is kind of crazy when you think about, what we know about other primates. And then we have these adorable teeny tiny little gray mouse lemurs, and they go into something called torpor. So torpor is sort of like a shorter state of hibernation. So they will sort of have more periods of arousal and waking up. And so these guys also are doing it in terms of sort of dealing with these lean seasons, these dry seasons where there's a scarce amount of resources. So during the seasons where there's lots of food, they're eating as much as they can. They're storing fat actually in their hind legs and their tails. And they can store up to about 35% of their body weight. And again, this helps them to survive these lean periods. So super interesting, super crazy things that, that only we find with the lemurs. So sort of moving into the second phase, why is Madagascar vanishing? Why is, why are the lemurs so under threat, and as well as all the other biodiversity that we find across the island? Well, Madagascar is considered one of the top conservation priorities in the world. It's considered a biodiversity hotspot. And by definition, that just means that it has at least 1,500 endemic vascular plants, and it has 30% or less of its natural vegetation left. And sadly, Madagascar is well beyond less than 30%. In fact, most of the natural vegetation, the original forest cover, has been destroyed in Madagascar. And so what remains is really quite fragmented, and there's very little primary forest left on the island, sadly. There's also been some recent research that just came out this year that was looking at the impacts of climate change and doing some modeling to sort of see how climate change is going to impact the island. And sadly, it predicts that the remaining rainforest habitats will be lost by the end of the century. So lots of sort of bad news, unfortunately. And as with many other biodiverse places, Madagascar is under threat because of an array of human-induced disturbances. So slash and burn agriculture, this is one of the main reasons why we have lost so much forest in Madagascar. And you can sort of see a picture here where you burn a patch of forest, and then you sort of let the ground lay for like a year or however long, and then you can go back and plant rice or whatever, but then eventually it will stop producing, and then you have to sort of move on to the next patch. So it's very unsustainable when you have a large number of population across this island performing slash and burn agriculture. Of course, there's illegal logging. Madagascar is home to many precious hardwoods like rosewood and ebony, palisander. So there's people who are going in and logging the forests and then using this precious hardwood to make, very, very expensive furniture and guitars and, canopy beds and things like that. There's issues with mining and, of course, charcoal production, hunting for bushmeat, as well as for the pet trade. So I want to talk a little bit about the pet trade, because this is one of the areas in which my research focuses. So we've heard a lot about, the pet trade, and sort of, it's been fairly well documented in Old World monkeys, New World monkeys, and apes, and sort of the negative impacts that it has had. These things have been documented and acknowledged. But the trade in strepsirrhine primates, which are the lemurs, the lorises, and the galagos, in comparison, it's really been more recently acknowledged. So for example, in terms of the lemurs, it wasn't until 2015 that my colleague Kim Reuter and some of her colleagues actually did the first large-scale investigation of pet lemurs on Madagascar, where she found that more than 28,000 lemurs had been negatively impacted. These are wild-caught animals, by the pet trade from the year 2010 to mid 2013. And this is only sort of looking at a small portion of the island. So that number is probably quite an underestimate. So these animals are really being impacted by the pet trade. And it's something that's sort of a newer area of research. And just to sort of give a bit of information sort of about the pet trade and thinking about, is this legal? It's not. So it is illegal to capture wild lemurs. It's illegal to own them as pets, and they are protected under national and international laws. They are CITES 1 appendix. So, it's, illegal to trade them, to export them. Of course, they are also listed under the IUCN Red List. As I mentioned, 95% are endangered or critically endangered. And the thing is that lemurs in Madagascar are captured from wild populations. So, when you have 95% that are already so endangered, when you start pulling animals from the wild, again, this is very unsustainable. And so it's not like they're, breeding them and selling them. These animals are coming directly from wild populations. So not good news for the lemurs. And so kind of thinking about, all of these disturbances, all these human-induced disturbances, and mining and charcoal and slash and burn and illegal pet trade, why are these things happening? Why is Madagascar vanishing before our eyes? Well, unfortunately, it's the story that we find in many places, in many primate habitat countries. It's poverty, political instability, which leads to sort of this lack of law enforcement, and of course, then corruption. And so sadly, these are all things that Madagascar they're impacted by. Madagascar is one of the poorest countries in the world. I think it's in the top 5 poorest countries in the world. So most people there are living on less than $2 a day. And so when you sort of have people who are just trying to survive and get through day to day and, feed their families, this is sort of what ends up happening. And we have to sort of maybe turn to the forest in order to feed our family, or, cut down some logs and sell them to make some money, etc. Okay, so now to sort of bring it all together, I wanted to talk a little bit about the novel approaches, excuse me, to conservation that can be used to address research questions, conservation, issues. So social media obviously is a huge thing for conservation, for environmental groups, for relaying scientific information, and it can be a really positive thing. We can raise lots of money, we can bring attention to species, that really need it. And, these things are really fantastic, but social media can also be super negative, as I'm sure many of you have found. And so we can see sort of, viral videos of endangered animals being treated poorly or being used as photo props, things like that. And so of course those things kind of go viral, and then we sort of have this perpetuation of people sharing and liking and thinking, oh, like it's okay to have a pet chimpanzee, or I'd really love to have a pet lemur or a capuchin monkey. And of course when we see celebrities or any sort of famous person doing these things, it sort of makes it 10 times worse. And social media has been a way, in terms of the different platforms, so Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, that a lot of researchers have actually turned to in order to conduct their research. So my colleague Anna Nakaris has done a lot of research using YouTube and Instagram, et cetera, looking into the illegal trade of slow lorises. And so we wanted to, my colleagues and I, what we really wanted to do was to see if there was anything sort of inappropriate going on in terms of people talking about wanting pet lemurs, selling pet lemurs, advertising, things like that on Twitter. And so we turned to this sort of social media platform in order to collect our data. And so let's go over some of the results. So the great thing about Twitter is, I think we paid maybe $20 a month to download the data. So it's really an inexpensive way to do research. So you don't need like giant grants or anything like that. And you sort of, come up with keywords, a large list of different keywords that you're going to, put into the system. So that way, any tweet that is tweeted with those keywords will kind of come into your database. So of course we came up with a giant list of keywords involving pet lemurs. King Julian being one of them, because a lot of people love the movie, and they'll, if they see a ring-tailed lemur, they call it King Julian. So what ended up happening? So this was in early 2016 where we were collecting the data, and we ended up getting almost 14,000 tweets from the time that we started to the time that we ended. And so we were really just collecting data for anything that was referencing lemurs. And then we were able to sort of use those keywords as a way to collect that. Then we identified about 613 individuals through those tweets that were saying that they wanted a pet lemur. 744 of those tweets were linked to a viral video that actually went viral during our data collection. And this was actually a really happy accident. Back in 2016, there was a video of two young Malagasy boys in a village who were sort of petting and scratching a pet ring-tailed lemur. And this ring-tailed lemur kept sort of motioning for them to keep petting him when they would stop. And so people just thought it was the most adorable thing. And this video went viral, and there was, it was like all over the news. And during that time, we were collecting tweets on pet lemurs. And so during the viral video period, we saw an uptick in the data in terms of people tweeting about how they really wanted a pet lemur. So, these viral videos do have an impact. Most tweets didn't reference the type of pet lemurs people wanted, but we found that when they did, they were wanting ring-tailed lemurs, which is the species that I study. And so, what does this all mean? Well, viral content can have really huge impacts on a species, on their, their long-term survival in the wild, and also it can have an impact on sort of how they're perceived. And so, this is a really good platform in terms of thinking about those types of questions and not having to spend a lot of money to get that data. So it was a quite successful project. So one of the other novel ways that's been around for quite a while is turning to citizen science. So it's quite a novel approach, to investigate different scientific questions or conservation issues, and it's become increasingly popular. And so the great thing about citizen science is it allows you to facilitate research on a larger scale. You can tap into new sources of information. And again, you just have to maybe set up a website or a page or something like that, and it's not really going to cost you too much money. So, again, it's a way to not have to worry about paying a lot to do the research that you want. So back in 2015, the Pet Lemur Survey was launched by my colleagues Kim Reuter and Melissa Schaefer. And it was in order to collect data on pet lemurs in Madagascar. And so this survey, it actually allows people to anonymously report pet lemurs that they have encountered while in Madagascar. And so they answer some questions on an online survey, which takes about 5 minutes. And then we're able to sort of pull that information and go through it to pull out information that we are interested in terms of trying to understand the pet lemur trade, since it's such a new area of research. So here's just sort of a little screenshot of some aggregated data from the Pet Lemur Survey, looking at reported sightings of pet lemurs in the different regions. And so, we had over 1,000 online anonymous surveys, and we were able to pull the data out of that. And we were actually able to provide really, detailed information to the Ministry of Environment in Madagascar about the pet lemur issue to try and encourage them to take this issue seriously and hopefully, make changes and try to increase, law enforcement about this. In addition to this anonymous survey, Dr. Reuter and Schaefer, they also created household surveys. So a bunch of us helped do on-the-ground surveys in Madagascar across different parts. So central Madagascar, eastern Madagascar, southwestern Madagascar, et cetera. And so we were able to collect a lot of information. And this has resulted in numerous peer-reviewed publications addressing the pet lemur issue. And so one example of that is a paper that my colleagues and I published back in 2019, looking at the illegal trade of lemur cata, which is the ring-tailed lemur. And so we were examining the anonymous surveys as well as the on-the-ground surveys. And so what we were looking at and what we found was that ring-tailed lemurs are the species that is most often reported in terms of pet lemurs in Madagascar. So if you look here at the figure, we have over 1,000 reports, and then over 2,000 lemurs from 32 different species were reported. So we have 111 species of lemur, and we have about 32 different species that are being impacted by the trade that we know of to date. And then we had to look for sort of unique reports. So 232 reports, 476 individuals. And of that, 180 reports we were sure were reporting individual unique ring-tailed lemurs. So we needed to make sure that we weren't counting one individual twice, right? So there were 286 individual ring-tailed lemurs that we were able to find being reported through this data. And we don't know exactly why ring-tailed lemurs seem to sort of be the most popular or the most reported. It may be because they have sort of a wider geographic range. They're the most terrestrial of the lemurs, so they're spending a lot of time on the ground. And they also do really well in captivity. So you will often find them in zoos, around the world. And so they tend to survive. So this is speculation, but this is probably some of the reasons why they may be targeted. And so here is a map of Madagascar. And so here we're showing the locations of the captive ring-tailed lemurs that were reported. And so we have, these large dots with numbers 1, 2, and 3. And so the dots are showing the locations and of where the pet ring-tailed lemurs are. And so there's sort of these three main sort of hot spots where you see numbers 1, 2, and 3. So we have Tuliar, Anakau, and Fort Dauphin. And these are very popular tourist destinations. And the thing about pet lemurs is that we find them sort of all across the island, rural and, in rural areas and city areas. And we find them, expats, a lot of French people will have them as pets, but as well as a lot of businesses will host them in order to draw in tourists. And a lot of Malagasy people also will have pet lemurs. And these dots are sort of showing the size proportion to the number of animals that were indicated there. So, Tuliar sort of being the largest of where we see the most pet lemurs. And then finally, this figure here, it's showing the percentage of ring-tailed lemurs that are and that are not cared for by the same owner. And these were according to reports on aggression. So for the individuals who reported that their ring-tailed lemur pet was really aggressive, they do not own them anymore. So they would get rid of them. When we see less aggression, the individuals were sort of still keeping their pet ring-tailed lemurs. So, again, this is sort of another product of the pet trade. These animals are being wild captured when they're young, babies or juveniles. And when they reach sexual maturity, they tend to become aggressive. And this is usually when they're disposed of, either let go, killed and eaten, or try to give to sort of a facility or something like that, where there really aren't many in Madagascar, really only 2 or 3, where they can sort of bring these animals, unfortunately. But this work really allowed us to kind of gain a lot of insight into the pet lemur, oh, here's another cat, the pet lemur trade in Madagascar, and sort of species that are being targeted and things like that. And so the final approach that I wanted to talk about was wildlife forensic genetics. So DNA barcoding, it's a method of species identification. And so you're using short sequences of DNA from specific gene or genes. And then you compare that sequence to a reference library of the DNA sequences. And then what you're able to do is individually identify a species or an organism. And so this method has been used with great success in a variety of different illegally poached wildlife. So you can kind of see here just some of the little headlines, in terms of how DNA barcoding has been used for conservation. So looking at elephants being poached, sharks, also in the bushmeat trade, you can go to a bushmeat market and collect animals that have been poached and are being sold, and you can pull DNA from them and then put it into, and then run it against the reference library to figure out what species you're looking at. So really, really useful in terms of conservation. When we decided to use this technique, this methodology for a project that we started, I think in 2015, and data collection started in 2016, it had never been used to sort of look at primates specifically, and definitely not lemurs. So we thought we could maybe use this to gain information about the pet trade. And so what we have done is we've collected lots and lots of lemur poop, and we call it poop science, throughout ring-tailed lemurs' geographic range. So for this particular project, we're focusing on one species, the ring-tailed lemur, because it is the species that we study, but also it just happens to be the most reported and popular of the lemur species in the pet trade. And so we collect lots of ring-tailed lemur poop from wild populations. And then we also collected samples from pets that were still being kept as pets, and also ring-tailed lemurs that had ended up in some sanctuaries and that were being rehabilitated. And so we have sort of all these different samples, and they're all collected non-invasively because you just kind of wait for them to poop and then you get your sample. And then we do some microsatellite genotyping, which is all being done at the Primate Molecular Ecology Lab, Andrea Baden's lab at Hunter, our colleague. And so what we're able to do is we're going to be able to determine the hotspots of where wild captures are happening. So we're going to be able to compare these DNA sequences of wild populations to individuals that have either ended up at a sanctuary or that are still being kept as pets. And we don't know where they've come from. The ring-tailed lemurs have a wide geographic range, as I've mentioned. And so it's very hard to just look at an animal and say, oh, well, it must have come from this national park or that national park, from the south or from central Madagascar. And so by using this wildlife forensic genetic barcoding, we're going to be able to do that. And this will then allow us to have targeted conservation, very species-specific targeted conservation in the areas where we know are hotspots and where these animals are being targeted. And so we do have a paper that's going to be coming out probably any minute now. And so this will be the first publication since we started working on this project in 2016, where we have 106 adult ring-tailed lemurs from nine geographic localities across Madagascar. And so, yeah, so you'll have to look for that. And then finally, I just wanted to kind of come to this sort of conclusion about this whole talk and sort of thinking about thinking outside the box. That's really what it's all about. Finding, like-minded collaborators who are willing to sort of think outside the box or to look to other disciplines or sub-disciplines and sort of see what kind of methodologies or techniques that they're using in order to sort of answer questions that you might have thought, that's going to be really hard to collect data on. It might be too dangerous to go to do household surveys and ask people about illegal activities, or we just don't have the money. We can't get grants for this. There's lots of other ways to address conservation issues, to try and figure out the answers that you need in order to make positive impacts for the species that you're studying. So, think outside the box or the tree hole, if you're a lemur. So that is the end, and I thank you for your attention and for listening, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Hi, Tara. There are a couple of questions in your chat box. If you can see the chat box, or do you want me to just read them out?
Sorry, I've got it right there. Okay. I will read these. Okay. So let's see. Okay, so Dr. Paulin, I'm gonna butcher the names, I'm so sorry. Yasanthi Joseph Nirmaral, College for Women. Does Madagascar experience low temperatures for lemurs to hibernate, or at what temperature do they become dormant? So this is a good question. Yes, Madagascar does experience low temperatures. I mean, I've been in Madagascar in the rainforest where it can get down to almost freezing in the winter. So the austral winter there. And I'm not exactly sure what the temperature is in terms of when dwarf lemurs will start hibernating, or when mouse lemurs will go into torpor. It's more seasonal based. As far as my knowledge goes. I do have some colleagues that study this, but it's really where they're looking to hibernate and go into torpor when there is a lean season. So during these dry seasons, and it can still even get cold, at night during the dry seasons, but I'm not sure exactly on the temperature. And then it says, how would you test the integrity of data collected through citizen science programs? Oh, that's a great question. Yeah, so it depends on what your program is. There are lots of different citizen science programs that will actually do some online training, for the people who are participating, and they'll actually have people apply and maybe, screen them and things like that to see sort of who's going to be involved in the project. So that's sort of one way. In terms of the integrity of the data for the Pet Lemur Survey, of course, it's totally anonymous. And so really the only way what we can do is sort of go through that data is what we're looking at is sort of to making sure when we're using that data, that it is, we're not using something that's been reported by one person and then somebody else like a year later reported the same individual, and we're kind of getting that information twice. So, it's sort of really kind of combing through your data, and it may be having multiple people look through it to make sure that you're sort of, not counting things more than once and sort of, inflating results or something like that. Okay, so we have another question from Raksha Hanavara. So what is the status of the natural habitat of lemurs? As in, what is the intensity of human encroachment and how damaging has this been to the number of individuals? Another good question. Yeah, so I would say that there's, I mean, lemurs are the most endangered primates in the world. 95% are critically endangered or endangered. And the population is growing. I think it's at 23 million now in Madagascar. And, slash and burn agriculture still continues, charcoal production, illegal logging, mining, all of these things are still happening. So again, most of the habitat, the original forest cover is fragmented or, or gone. When I was conducting my research with my colleague and we were doing ring-tailed lemur work, and we were trying to visit all of the known locations where they had been reported for their geographic range, we did come across some sites where there was just nothing left. There were empty forests. All the animals had been hunted out. So it's quite sad. So it is having a huge impact. And of course, climate change as well. In terms of the number of individuals, it really just sort of depends on the species that we're talking about because there are so many. In terms of ring-tailed lemurs, we did do a rapid survey a few years ago to sort of reassess the species, which hadn't been done for 20 plus years. And at the sites, the 32 sites that we looked at, we think that there's maybe somewhere between 2,500 to 5,000 adult individuals left in the wild. Okay. So as you mentioned, the main reason for vanishing of these primate or other species, forest fire, logging, et cetera, and your team has also been researching current status of ownership of where pet lemur owners have often been considered wealthy. Have you found evidence of political, livelihood, or other factors influencing pet lemur ownership that drive them to do so? Would you like to say something about your experiences with your team in research through citizen science and how it develops a way to minimize awareness? Okay. So yes, in terms of ownership of pet lemurs, we have looked at different things. And you don't have to be wealthy to own a pet lemur. In fact, they sell for just a few dollars, is what we've found. And so really, when we look at sort of individuals across the board, like I said, we can find individuals who are living in really rural locations who have a pet lemur, and then people who are living in the city who are perhaps wealthier. You find, Malagasy people, expats, local businesses, even people within like law enforcement and things like that that will own pet lemurs. And just because you own a pet lemur doesn't mean you take good care of it. So most pet lemurs are, housed or, in very small cages, sometimes alone. They're fed rice or, other inappropriate foods that are not, part of their natural diets. In some of the photos, you might have seen them tied around the waist. So this is also quite common where they're sort of tied and restricted. So really not a good situation. And so I think a lot of people really like to have pet lemurs is because they think they're cute, they think they're adorable. And, it's sort of like here how we have like a cat or a dog or something, they kind of are just like, oh, I have a pet lemur. But again, this is an area where we still, don't know enough. And certainly more research will, is sort of warranted. But it is hard to sort of get this type of data. So the experiences with citizen science. So in terms of that, certainly I would say that the Pet Lemur Survey was a really positive thing for our research and in terms of raising awareness. So we also, along with sort of the Pet Lemur Survey data and the publications, we also did a sort of a pilot project called Keeping Lemurs Wild, where we sort of brought together different NGOs in Madagascar, different researchers. We had sort of this huge launch party. We created posters that were educating tourists and local people about the pet lemur trade and what to do if you see a pet lemur. And so we had these posters, we got grant to create these posters that had all this information on it, had the Pet Lemur Survey website to sort of collect more data. And it was really quite successful. And I still get emails today where people are like, hey, I saw your pet lemur poster, at this hotel or, at the train station or whatever. So I think it actually has raised quite a bit of awareness. And I think people are starting to take the pet lemur problem definitely more seriously. But of course, there's always more work to be done. Okay, another question from the College for Women. Oh, thank you. Excellent talk, thank you. What are the legal measures taken by the government to curb the illegal trade? Well, sadly, not much. In fact, most of the time, if people are reporting pet lemurs, they, or if we were to find a pet lemur and we went to the, the ministry or to the local police, they would either do nothing or they would expect you to, pay to have them go and remove it and then house it somewhere and make sure that it's taken care of. So really there's very little law enforcement. Pet lemurs are very out in the open. There's many establishments that don't have legal permission or permits to have, captive lemurs. But unfortunately, sort of everybody just sort of turns a blind eye. And of course, every once in a while, like people will get riled up and then they'll start, confiscating lemurs, and then they're like, oh, where do we put them? And so that's also a big problem. So in terms of, government, impact for the trade, I would say is quite minimal. Okay, another question from Saram
Dasgupta.
Thank you. No one's ever going to speak to me again. Okay. Okay. How much of cooperation are you getting from the law enforcement agencies to act on the information you gather? So we did have this one sort of meeting with the ministry that went quite well, but unfortunately, very little was done following that. So not much. And what is the main behavioral patterns that they have difference? What does that say? Difference presently. I'm not sure I understand that part.
Okay, how I think that he's trying to ask how the behavioral patterns have changed. Has there any? Do you see any changes in the behavioral patterns over the period of time?
Oh, for like the law enforcement and things, I would say no. At least in terms of what I have seen. I really don't think there's much being done. We are still trying, a lot of people now are trying to raise more awareness about this. The one thing that was actually successful is the Office of National Tourism for Madagascar created a program called My Madagascar. So it was a big social media thing where they were encouraging travelers to Madagascar to share their photos on social media with the hashtag My Madagascar. And because there are so many captive lemurs at hotels and restaurants, there's a lot of inappropriate human-lemur contact, feeding, et cetera, photos, things like that are happening at these different facilities. And so when we saw this going on, myself and a bunch of lemur colleagues got together, and we had one of our colleagues who's Malagasy go and actually have a meeting with the Office of National Tourism, and we had a whole letter sort of kind of breaking down sort of why this was sort of not the best, thing to be doing, and sort of how it was going to impact wild lemur populations. And it's like, if you're the Office of National Tourism, and Madagascar needs tourism, and right now, obviously with the pandemic, that's not happening and it's having huge impacts. But if your big pull for tourism is lemurs, you need them in the forests, and you need them to survive, and you need them to have long-term survival. And so they were actually, they responded and they pulled down the photos, and they stopped posting things like that or sharing them, which was really fantastic. Okay, so the pink 3199, have there been initiatives that work with the communities to improve their livelihoods, which could curb their motivations to hunt and trade pet lemurs? Absolutely. So I used to, my colleague's organization, Lemur Love, when I was with them for 5 years, we did lots of community-based conservation. And let me just say that honestly, conservation doesn't work any other way. If you're not working with, talking with, and sort of really kind of one-on-one with people of the local community, and figuring out sort of what's going on, and what are their needs, what are their dreams, why are things happening the way that they're happening, and sort of can you help in some way, or can you make improvements? Conservation is just not going to work. So some things that we had done, we started a collaboration with the Women's Association, and helped the Women's Association in terms of sort of funding them to, they started microloan projects, they started a chicken farming project. They sort of, took it and ran with it, and were able to sort of really create economic independence for themselves. So some of the other things that I've been working on more recently in different area is school lunch programs. and also, conservation education. So of course, education is really crucial. So yeah, all of these things, a lot of different, NGOs working in different parts of the island are doing a lot of different types of community-based conservation. And so it's like, if we can help local communities in terms of improving their livelihoods, and they don't have to worry that their families are starving, their kids can go to school, then they're not going to have to turn to illegal activities. So is pratique das, is the demand for pet ring-tailed lemur high in Madagascar in relation to the rest of the world? Okay, that's also a really good question. So I didn't mention this in the talk, but when we're talking about pet ring-tailed lemurs, certainly there are places in the world, including the United States, where it is legal to own a pet lemur or some sort of other type of primate. So the pet situation in Madagascar is completely separate from the rest of the world, in that the pet lemurs that you see in Madagascar are literally coming from the forest. They're wild captured. Whereas the rest of the world, typically when you see a pet lemur, they're coming from sort of a captive breeder. And so I would say, yeah, pet ring-tailed lemurs seem to be pretty popular. I mean, they are the ones that you tend to see on social media a lot in terms of pets. And they do seem to be the ones that people are getting rid of when they become aggressive. So I would say the demand is probably high. But again, I don't have any data on that. Okay, so another question from Raksha Hanavara. How do we say that?
Honavara.
Okay, can you share what got you interested in lemurs initially? And what are some characteristics of lemurs that interest you most? Oh, thank you. So I've always loved animals since I was a little girl. And I was always really fascinated with primates, in particular, mountain gorillas. And growing up and looking to Jane Goodall and Diane Fossey were sort of like role models, but I didn't realize like, oh, that's something that people can do for a living. But years later, I was in university and I took a class with the famous lemur scientist and conservationist, Dr. Patricia Wright. And I took her primate conservation class and it changed my life. I learned about lemurs, I learned about their plight, I learned about Madagascar, and I did a study abroad back in 2004. And I got to go there for the first time. And I was, at that point, I was just completely hooked. And I was like, this is what I have to do for the rest of my life. I have to help, protect these animals and educate, people about them and raise awareness and, hopefully turn some people into lemur lovers like myself. And so the characteristics that interest me the most, well, I guess I'll have to talk about the species that I most love, which is the ring-tailed lemur. So they're really interesting. They're the males and females are basically the same size. Sometimes the females are a little bit larger. And again, they're female dominant. And when the males are competing to have access to females for mating, they do something called stink fighting. So I don't know if any of you have seen this, but if you just Google ring-tailed lemur stink fighting, you'll come up with some really fun videos to watch. So lemurs do a lot of scent marking and scent communication, which is another thing that sort of sets them apart from other primates. And so males will take their tails and they will rub them on their scent glands, and then they sort of waft their tails over their head. And then the males will sort of have this little scent stink fight, and you can either sort of waft your tail back or you can run away. And then sometimes that will, progress and there will be actual contact and they'll fight. But I just love watching them kind of go crazy, and they make funny little noises, and they put their ears back and they kind of just go bonkers running around the forest, stink fighting. And they also do stink flirting, which is basically where they're scenting their tails, but they're wafting them and they're waving them right in front of the female's face in an invitation to mate, which I think is really adorable. And the other thing that I think is really cute is that there's some lemur species, the ruffed lemurs, the ring-tailed lemurs, and the shifakas, and they do sunbathing. So you see a lot of photos of them sort of doing that traditional little like yoga pose, which is really sweet. And that's for thermoregulation. So yeah, very cool. Okay, can you elaborate a little bit about the rehab of rescued lemurs to their wild habitat? Have there been any successes? Notwithstanding the support from government, have scientific protocols been developed to aid it? Okay, yeah. So in terms of the rehab for rescue lemurs, there's a facility, the Lemur Rescue Center, the Reniala Lemur Rescue Center in the south of Madagascar, and then not affiliated with it, but with the same name, there's a Reniala up in the northwest. And so they both sort of take in a number of pet lemurs to sort of house them and try to rehab them, etc. Unfortunately, there's very few places like that in Madagascar. And the thing is, once a lemur has been a pet, they've been through a tremendous amount of trauma, unfortunately, most of them. Some of them have been abused, some of them have injuries, some of them are so aggressive. They've been housed individually, so they don't even know how to be a lemur. Like they can't even be housed with other lemurs. And the thing about lemurs is they're social. They're very social animals. And so this is sort of the most unnatural thing for them. So sadly, ex-pet lemurs, the chances of them being rehabbed to the point where they can just go back into the wild is probably pretty slim, which is very sad. So it's sort of more the type of situation where you would maybe have to have, areas where you can have animals like free ranging, but maybe not sort of in contact with wild populations, because we also have to be worried about possible disease transmission and things like that. There have been some reintroductions of lemur species that have had various success. Several years ago, the one that I'm thinking of is the ruffed lemurs. So very variable success, but this isn't something that's really done very often. It's a bit tricky. It takes a lot of work. It takes a lot of money. And usually the success rates are probably not great. And certainly there are protocols. So the IUCN, like species survival committees, for each species, they all have protocols. And in terms of doing any sort of reintroduction, there's very specific protocols that have to be followed in terms of preparing individuals for release or reintroduction, and also like in terms of what happens after that, in terms of like following and collecting data and doing checkups and sort of that whole kind of thing. So those things definitely have been in place for a long time. Okay, could you please tell us something about lemur ethnographic histories, like any cultural positive or negative influence? How local people think about these pet animals or about these population loss? Do they relate lemurs with their sociocultural environments? Oh, okay, cool. Yeah, so Madagascar, as I mentioned, is super interesting, and the culture is sort of really fascinating. There's multiple tribes in Madagascar. I think maybe I want to say like maybe 22, and they each have individual dialects. So sometimes if you are from very far in the north and you somehow travel to the south, you may not be able to totally communicate. So there's different dialects, and each tribe sort of has their own customs and taboos. So it kind of depends. There's a lot of positive and negative taboos depending on sort of where you come from. So for instance, the Ai, which is the largest nocturnal lemur, also super cool and interesting. One of the sort of negative taboos that is believed in practice is if somebody sees one of them, they have to kill it because they think somebody in their family will die. But there's also positive taboos for other species, like the Indri. The Malagasy culture is really sort of based around their ancestors, and so they think like that the Indri is like one of their ancestors, and so it's protected. So there's lots of really cool, interesting sort of things like that in terms of like cultural positive and negative taboos and things like that. Sure. In terms of local people and sort of thinking about lemurs and pets and things like that, of course, it's going to sort of depend on sort of who you talk to. It's sort of hard to sort of say generally, but certainly a lot of my Malagasy colleagues and Malagasy students and things like that I've met, of course, are very aware of what's going on, and they're working tremendously hard, to save these animals and to protect them. This is their heritage, their culture. And then of course there's, people who may be less less educated or may not actually know. I've often met a lot of people who ask me, why do you study lemurs here? Do you come so far? And they don't realize that it's the only place that they're found. So it's sort of, it's sort of like, two ends of the spectrum. And certainly many people I talk to and I've met and worked with in Madagascar, they realize, that lemurs and ecotourism is sort of a very important thing for Madagascar, and to have tourists come in terms of, the economy. And a lot of people you meet are sort of involved in ecotourism in some way. So certainly it's really important. And I would say that a lot of people do know about that. Okay. Okay. Oh, thank you so much. I'm glad it was informative and you guys found it interesting. Okay. With all the information you have gathered, where do you see the status of the lemurs in the next 25 years? Ooh, yeah, so that's a scary question. I try to remain positive and hopeful. So I do have days where, where you hear some news or, something's going on and it really gets you down. But there's so many people out there who are working so hard to raise awareness and to do, to raise money and to make sure that these animals are going to be around for future generations. So I'm hopeful that, we won't see any extinctions, any species extinctions of lemurs in the next 25 years. But, if we're gonna save them, there's a lot of work to be done, and it needs to be done. It needs to be done now.
I guess the next question would be the last question.
Okay.
For keeping you here so long.
Oh, no, that's okay. I don't mind. I mean, basically, I just want to talk about lemurs all the time. So I'm just glad you guys are interested. My family and friends are just like, could you just shut up already? Okay, so do you want to say the name so I don't butcher it?
Deepika Valsarajan.
Yes. Okay, it says, hello, I've come across a lemur rescued from illegal trade in India with blunt teeth. Is that common practice to chip the teeth? Oh my goodness. Wow, that's very interesting. No, that's not something I've ever heard of or seen. And I don't know if it's just the canines that they're talking about, the sort of the sharp ones, but we have not come across that, at least in our own research. I know that it's common practice to pull teeth of slow lorises because they have a venomous bite. So I know that is a common practice, but I haven't seen anything like that with lemurs. And I wonder if it was done on purpose or if something happened to the lemur, like if it was injured or something. But wow, it's really interesting. I mean, I wonder where that animal came from, because as far as we know, pet lemurs are not being trafficked outside of the island. There have been attempts where, people have gotten caught, but it's not something that we know of that is happening. So that's kind of an interesting case. I'd like to talk more about that. But yeah, thank you.
There's one more question.
Okay.
Dr. Gopal Dikshit wants to know, what types of behavioral changes have you noticed in the lemurs? I guess over the period of time from the time when you began studying them. That's like 16 years ago.
Yeah, I started as an undergraduate in my study abroad. Well, certainly, I mean, I've studied a couple of different species and I've worked in a lot of different areas. And so it's kind of hard to say behavioral changes. The longest work I've done with the same groups was I worked for 4 consecutive years at Samanapasuts National Park in the south, and we were following the same groups of lemurs. And unfortunately, the south is the poorest of Madagascar, that is sort of the poorest of the poor. It's very prone to droughts. And Madagascar in general has very sort of harsh, unpredictable climates. And so in terms of behaviors that I've seen there that are sort of, I guess, animals just trying to survive, they are sort of eating very strange things and surviving on things that you wouldn't expect them to. The ring-tailed lemurs, of course, high mortality rates during these droughts where, a lot of group sizes are changing because animals are dying. And of course, females are not giving birth, or they give birth and the infants die and things like that. So the droughts have a really huge impact, even on ring-tailed lemurs, which, I mean, you think that they can just survive anything, and they do a lot of the time, but, there comes a point where even, the flexible ring-tailed lemur, it can't survive. So those are some sort of interesting things that I saw. and then of course, coming out of a drought, you know, having these groups and populations sort of start to rebound and having more babies and things like that, sort of kind of incredible. So, yeah.
So, thank you so much, Dr. Clarke. This was a really informative talk. I learned a lot, especially nocturnal lemurs that hibernate and store fat in the tail. I mean, that is the first time I've never
It's
heard
like
of
science fiction. I mean, this is why lemurs are crazy. They're so fun.
Yeah, and every lemur has its own character. You know, you can't classify them together. I mean, it's
Yeah.
so wide variety and diverse. They're very diverse. I mean, it was very interesting. Thank you so much,
Thank
Tara,
you
for
guys so much
spending-
for the invite and all the really fantastical questions. And I mean, please, if you want to the group, the Zoom group, I mean, I think you guys might already have my email, but if you want to chat more, you have questions, and I'd love to hear more about the pet lemur. If there's any other information about it, you know, you can give my email to them. And of course, you can find me on the North Carolina State, you know, Anthropology website. My email is there. So.
Yeah, so that was really interesting. Now I'm going to ask Ram to come over and to say a few words, and I'm going to switch off my video because
Okay.
internet is unstable.
Oh.
Hi. So this is the formal vote of thanks.
Oh, thank you, Ram.
Thanks, Dr. Tara, for the really engaging talk about almost every aspect of Madagascar, from its geological history to human colonization, the amazing diversity, and of course, our first love, the primates. We also appreciate that you spoke about the myriad threats facing the biodiversity in Madagascar, which is very important, and most of which are also huge problems in India. And like you said, the Madagascar and Indian subcontinent were connected until about, let's say, about 50 million years ago. And may I add that they're still connected, if not by land, then by the diversity of the life they host, including prosimians, the slender lorises that we have in the south, and the slow lorises in the east and northeast of India.
Yeah.
The problems that they face is also shared.
Yeah.
I'm sure Indian primatologists and the upcoming budding students of Indian primatology will take note of some of the really innovative conservation solutions that you have mentioned and apply them in an Indian scenario. We would like to thank you again, Dr. Tara Clarke. It was a pleasure having you. We hope to continue having this conversation about lemurs and wildlife conservation in general. Before I end the session, if you have a word or two for us, please feel free to.
Yeah, well, I just want to say thank you guys so much for this opportunity. It's always really wonderful to talk to people who are interested in lemurs or want to learn more about them, and of course talk about the threats and sort of, you know, trying to figure out ways that we can help these amazing creatures, whether it's a slender loris, you know, a bonnet macaque, or a ring-tailed lemur, and sort of coming together and collaborating and sharing ideas and things like that, I think are really, really important. And having, you know, so communication between researchers and conservationists and stuff like that. So, you know, I'm really thrilled to be talking to you guys and to continue talking on, you know, about research or conservation or any of those things. So thank you so much.
Sure, we'd love to have you again here in the virtual platform of AIP to have more such interactions. So just to end it, I want all our audience to subscribe to our channel. It's a fledgling society and it's a fledgling channel. So tune in for more such talks. I hope this was really informative. We also have a website where you can register yourself. We are trying to be active in Twitter and Facebook also. We're trying to showcase Indian primatology to the world. So that's all. Thank you again, Dr. Tara, and thanks for all the organizers, including Smita, for hosting the talk. Thanks to all the participants for being so proactive and asking really wonderful questions. Thanks again.
Thank you so much, guys. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.